The hangar went silent when the pilots refused to fly. Serafina Vale, the company's powerful CEO, sat in her wheelchair beside a private jet she desperately needed to board before midnight. "No pilot is taking this aircraft up," the captain said. Then a grease-stained mechanic stepped forward. His name was Calder Voss. Everyone laughed when he said he could fly it. They stopped laughing when he opened the cockpit door. Calder wasn't just a mechanic. He had once been one of the most gifted test pilots in America. Until the accident that made him walk away from the sky forever. And tonight, he was about to return. Rain came down in long silver ropes over the private airfield outside the city, hammering the tarmac until the runway lights blurred into smeared halos of gold. Wind pushed sideways against the hangar doors, rattling the corrugated steel like something alive and impatient. Inside the vast, echoing bay, the Falcon X-9 sat gleaming under floodlights. Its white fuselage streaked with rain, engines already ticking with the low hum of pre-flight power. A dozen people moved around it in practice choreography, checking fuel lines, scanning tablets, murmuring into headsets. It looked, for a moment, like any other departure. It was not. A black sedan pulled beneath the shelter of the hangar overhang, and Serafina Vale wheeled herself out with the same brisk efficiency she brought to board meetings. Her tailored coat dark with a few stray raindrops, her jaw set in the particular way that made junior executives suddenly remember other places they needed to be. She was 38 years old, and until 7 months ago she had walked into this hangar on her own 2 legs. Now she moved through it in a chair, and she had made it clear to every person in her company that the chair changed nothing about who was in charge. She needed to reach the Halcyon Research Campus, nearly 400 miles north, before a board session convened at 8 in the morning. A merger worth billions hung on her presence there, on her voice in that room, on her signature at the bottom of a stack of documents that certain people very much wanted delayed. Missing that meeting was not an option she had allowed herself to consider. She rolled toward the aircraft stairs with the practiced calm of a woman who had never once let a room see her doubt herself. And that was when Captain Marlowe Keene stepped into her path and said flatly that he was not flying this tonight. Serafina stopped. Behind her, an aide nearly collided with the wheelchair. When she asked why not, Marlowe turned and pointed toward the illuminated cockpit, where a soft amber light blinked steadily against the darkness of the instrument panel, a small, dishonest star warning of something none of them yet understood. A caution indicator had appeared during final checks, flagging an inconsistency between the flight control computer and one of the aircraft's primary sensor arrays. It was not, on its own, catastrophic. It was, however, unexplained. And Marlowe had flown for 22 years, without ever once taking an unexplained warning into a storm. Beside him, the first officer had already pulled off his headset and was folding it with the finality of a man closing a book he did not intend to reopen. Serafina's voice sharpened as she reminded them that this aircraft cost more than most people made in a lifetime, and that she was being told it could not leave the ground because of a blinking light. Marlowe answered that he did not know what the light meant, and until someone did, the airplane stayed exactly where it was. Briar Knox, the company's head of flight safety, arrived at a near jog, rain still clinging to her shoulders, tablet already glowing in her hand, and confirmed what Marlowe already knew. Without identifying the source of the fault, no aircraft under her authority was leaving this hangar, board meeting or no board meeting, billions of dollars or no billions of dollars. Serafina looked at the 3 of them, at the rain, at the useless minutes ticking past on the enormous wall clock near the hangar office, and felt something cold and furious rising behind her ribs. It was in the middle of that argument, with voices climbing and umbrellas dripping onto the concrete, that a man crawled out from beneath the aircraft's belly, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had long since given up being useful for that purpose. He was not tall in any way that commanded a room, and his coveralls were the same faded navy as every other technician's on the floor. He had the kind of face people forgot easily, unremarkable in a crowd, which was, in its way, exactly the point. He had been listening to the argument from beneath the fuselage for nearly 2 minutes before he stood. And when he finally spoke, asking to see the system, his voice was quiet enough that half the hangar had to lean in to hear it. Every head turned. Serafina looked at him the way a woman looks at an object that has appeared somewhere it does not belong. And Marlowe let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Nobody in the hangar knew his name. He was a contractor, brought in 3 months earlier to handle avionics maintenance during a staffing shortage. The kind of quiet, competent employee whose presence registered only when something broke. He walked past the pilots without waiting for permission, climbed the short aircraft stairs, and disappeared through the cockpit door. For nearly 10 seconds, nobody in the hangar moved. Then his voice carried back out into the rain, calm and certain, telling them they were looking in the wrong place. Serafina wheeled herself closer to the base of the stairs, rain misting against her face, and for the first time that night her fury gave way to something sharper, curiosity. When she called up into the cockpit doorway asking him to explain, the man who emerged a moment later introduced himself, briefly and without ceremony, as Calder Voss. He held up a small diagnostic tablet and turned it so she could see the screen, explaining that there was a discrepancy between the readings coming from the aircraft's angle of attack sensor and the corresponding values inside the flight control computer. It was subtle, the kind of thing that under ordinary circumstances might have been dismissed as sensor drift, a known and forgivable quirk of instruments exposed to extreme temperature swings. But this was not drift. Drift accumulated gradually, in fractions of a degree over months. This discrepancy had appeared in a single, clean jump. Exactly the signature of a parameter that had been changed, rather than one that had simply wandered. Marlowe folded his arms and said that fixing airplanes did not mean a man was qualified to fly one, an edge of contempt in his voice he did not bother to disguise. Calder did not rise to it. He said only that he had never claimed he was going to fly it. A young ground crew member, eager to be useful, mentioned to no one in particular that Calder was a single father, that he picked his daughter up from school most afternoons, that he was just a maintenance contractor, and probably should not have been standing in the cockpit at all. Serafina filed the detail away silently. Though something in the way Calder had spoken, the flatness, the precision, the total absence of nervousness, in front of a room full of people who outranked him, made her look at him a second time. She asked if he had flown before, and it was not quite a question. He hesitated, then admitted that once he had. When she asked how long ago, he only said long enough, and nobody in the hangar knew the real shape of his past. As he studied the tablet further, his expression did not change, but something in his posture went very slightly still, the particular stillness of a person who has just found what he was looking for and does not like it. "This isn't a normal fault," he said. "A parameter this specific does not shift on its own during a routine pre-flight sequence. Someone adjusted it, recently, deliberately. If I'm right," he told her, "this was never a problem with the aircraft." When Serafina asked where the problem was, then Calder looked at her directly for the first time since coming down the stairs, and said it was with whoever had prepared it for takeoff. Nobody spoke. The engines continued their low hum in the background, patient and indifferent, and somewhere above the hangar the storm rolled on toward the coast, entirely unconcerned with the small, sudden fear that had just taken root among the people standing beneath it. Serafina called Breyer and Calder into the small glass-walled office at the edge of the hangar, and asked them both, without preamble, to pull every record connected to tonight's flight preparation, fuel logs, maintenance sign-offs, crew assignments, the digital trail of every hand that had touched the aircraft in the last 24 hours. Breyer began working immediately, grateful for once to have a clear task instead of an ambiguous threat. Calder lingered near the door, watching the rain streak sideways across the floodlit tarmac. And when Serafina reminded him that Marlowe, not she, had said fixing airplanes did not qualify a man to fly one, he admitted that Marlowe was not wrong, that being able to fix a problem and being willing to sit in the seat when the sky decided to test you were two very different things. When she asked which one he was, he did not answer right away. Thunder rolled somewhere far out over the water, distant enough to be more felt than heard. "He used to be both," he said eventually. He was still working out which one he was tonight. Breyer's voice cut through the moment, sharp with discovery. She had found a work order logged less than 3 hours earlier, authorizing an adjustment to the very sensor calibration Calder had flagged. The order carried a valid employee credential, approved on paper through the proper channels, and yet nobody currently in the hangar remembered issuing it, and no technician on the shift roster claimed to have performed the work. Someone had used a real login to make a change nobody would admit to making. Serafina felt the floor of the evening tilt again. She had built Vale Aeronautics from a single regional charter service into one of the most respected private aviation companies on the continent by trusting very few people completely and verifying everyone else constantly, and that instinct was now humming at a pitch she had not felt since the night of her own accident. "Find out whose credential that was," she said quietly, "and do it without telling anyone outside this room." Calder watched her for a moment before saying that whatever this was, it had started before tonight, that tonight had only been meant as the excuse. When she asked the excuse for what, he said simply, "For you not making it to that meeting." Records pulled from the personnel database confirmed what Calder had suspected from the moment he first opened the cockpit door. His file, buried under 3 months of routine maintenance contracts, told a story none of the ground crew had bothered to notice. Before he had ever picked up a wrench for Vale Aeronautics, Calder Voss had been one of the most decorated experimental test pilots the industry had produced in a generation, flying aircraft so new they did not yet have names, coaxing performance data out of airframes that existed on the very edge of what physics allowed. Serafina read the file twice, her thumb pausing over a section near the bottom that had been redacted down to little more than a date and a single line describing an incident during a high-altitude structural test. The rest of the record simply stopped. No termination notice, no formal resignation, only silence, stretching for years until his name resurfaced on a maintenance contract, listing basic certifications and nothing else. She found him near the aircraft, running a secondary diagnostic with the calm, unhurried focus of a man who had done this exact task 1,000 times before, in circumstances far more dangerous than a rain-soaked hangar, and asked why he had left. He did not look up immediately. He had lost someone, he finally said. A friend, another pilot. During a joint evaluation that pushed an airframe past its rated limits to gather data nobody else wanted to collect, something failed that should not have failed. He made it back. His friend did not. Serafina absorbed that without offering the reflexive sympathy most people reached for, and told him that was not the same as being afraid to fly. He agreed that it was worse, that it was knowing exactly what could go wrong, and choosing to go up anyway. She turned her chair slightly, studying the rain-streaked window rather than his face, and confessed that people looked at her now and saw someone who needed to be protected from disappointment. That she had watched board members redirect questions to her chief operating officer, instead of asking her directly, as though the wheelchair had moved up into her skull, along with her legs. When Calder said plainly that he did not feel sorry for her, she looked at him, surprised, and asked what he did feel. He answered that he thought she was a woman trying to prove something to a room full of people who had already made up their minds about her, and that she was doing it the hard way because she did not trust the easy way not to be a trap. The observation landed closer to true than she expected. Close enough that she felt something unfamiliar move behind her sternum. Whatever this sabotage was about, she said eventually, it was not really about her missing a meeting. It was about making people believe she could not be trusted to run her own company. And the two of them standing here arguing about old grief and new wheelchairs was exactly the kind of distraction someone wanted. Calder agreed that they should stop being distracted. Breyer returned a few minutes later with a face that told Serafina the news was not good before a single word left her mouth. The credential used to authorize the sensor recalibration belonged to a junior maintenance supervisor who had, according to the building's own access logs, left the property 4 hours before the change was made. Someone had used his login without his knowledge, from a terminal inside the operations building rather than the hangar itself, which meant whoever had done this had access to spaces most contractors never entered, and had walked past 3 separate security checkpoints without raising a single flag. Serafina absorbed the information with the flat, controlled expression she had spent years perfecting for exactly this kind of moment, and said only, "Get me Orson." Orson Creed arrived within the quarter hour, his coat still buttoned against the weather, his expression arranged into the particular blend of concern and competence he had spent 15 years perfecting as Serafina's chief operating officer. He had been with the company nearly as long as she had stood beside her through the early years of thin margins and impossible odds, had been, by every outward measure, the second most trusted person in the organization. He told her she should not be doing this tonight, that her body had already been through enough, that he could handle the board remotely, and nobody expected her to risk a storm like this. It was, on its surface, a reasonable thing to say. It was also precisely the wrong thing to say to her. And she asked whether he was worried about her health, or worried about her making it to that room. Something flickered behind his eyes, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but Serafina had spent 2 decades reading the faces of people negotiating against her, and she recognized the particular stillness of a man recalculating. Of course he was worried about her health, he said, too quickly. Calder stepped forward and pulled up a schedule log buried 3 layers deep in the flight operations system, showing a departure time modification made 2 days earlier, delaying tonight's flight window by exactly enough to place it directly inside the projected peak of the storm system, now battering the coastline. The modification carried the same access signature as the sensor recalibration. This was not random, he explained. Somebody had wanted this flight happening during the worst possible weather, using an aircraft flagged with a fault that would force the pilots to refuse. They did not need to hurt anyone. They only needed Serafina stuck on the ground while the board voted without her. Orson's composure cracked at the edges, as he called that a serious accusation to make with so little proof, and Calder answered evenly that he was not accusing him of anything yet, that he was only telling him what the data showed, and that he could decide how uncomfortable that made him. Orson left the hangar office a few minutes later, insisting he needed to make calls, his footsteps quick against the wet concrete outside. Breyer watched him go with narrowed eyes, and Serafina asked Calder why he had given Orson room to react instead of confronting him outright. "Guilty men who feel cornered destroy evidence," Calder said. "Guilty men who still feel like they have room to maneuver make mistakes." And he would rather watch him make one than force him to hide one. Serafina studied him for a long moment, something unfamiliar settling in her chest, the particular relief of standing beside someone whose instincts moved in the same direction as her own. For months, every advisor around her had counseled caution shaped like protection, urging her toward the safety of doing nothing. Calder offered no such comfort. He offered clarity instead, and she found, unexpectedly, that she trusted clarity far more. With the board convening in under 9 hours, she said they had better figure out how she was getting on that airplane, and Calder answered that they had, in fact, better find out. Marlowe, still standing near the aircraft stairs with his arms folded, overheard the exchange and stepped forward, his earlier certainty visibly eroding under the weight of everything he had just learned. If someone had sabotaged the aircraft to keep it grounded, he reasoned slowly, then fixing the sensor did not just clear them for takeoff. It removed the excuse someone had been counting on, which meant once they fixed it, whoever was behind this might try something else. Breyer's jaw tightened as she agreed they would secure the aircraft properly this time. Full manual inspection, camera coverage on every access point, no credential-based shortcuts. Serafina nodded once, decisively. The fear she had been holding at bay since Marlowe first refused to fly finally settling into something more useful. She told them to do it, and to find her a pilot willing to take this aircraft into that storm, because she was not losing her company to a man who thought a wheelchair made her easy to remove from the board. The silence that followed was heavier than any that had come before it, because everyone standing in that hangar office understood exactly who the next sentence was going to concern. Marlowe looked toward Calder first, an unreadable expression crossing his weathered face, and reminded him that he had said he was not going to fly it. Calder answered that he had said he had not decided, and that he had decided now. Marlowe asked whether he understood what he was offering, that this was not a training flight but 400 miles through a coastal storm with a passenger who could not easily evacuate if something went wrong. Calder said he understood exactly what he was offering. Marlowe was quiet for a long moment. then reached into a locked cabinet and withdrew a slim folder that had clearly not been opened in some time. An experimental flight certification bearing Calder's full name, a rating so specialized that fewer than a handful of pilots in the country had ever qualified to hold it. He had pulled the archive himself an hour earlier, half convinced the mechanic's confidence was bravado, and had found instead a record that made his own decorated career look modest by comparison. "You flew the Halbrook program," Marlowe said quietly, disbelief evident in his voice. "You set the altitude endurance record on the prototype airframe that became half our current fleet's engineering baseline." Calder said nothing, which was, in its own way, confirmation enough. "Even with a certification like that," Breyer said, cutting through the moment with characteristic bluntness, "she was not clearing this aircraft for departure without a full safety review, since extended leave from active flying changed reaction time, changed instinct, and she needed to see him demonstrate competency rather than simply read about it on paper." Calder nodded without hesitation and told her to test him, that he would rather prove it than assume it. What followed was nearly 2 hours of rigorous verification. Simulator runs, systems knowledge checks, conducted with a thoroughness that bordered on hostile, a physical assessment to confirm reflexes and coordination had not eroded during his years away from active cockpits. Calder submitted to every step without complaint, working through each evaluation with the same quiet competence he had shown beneath the aircraft's belly hours earlier. Serafina watched most of it from the office doorway, noticing the way his hands remained perfectly steady even during the simulator's deliberately induced failure scenarios, the way his voice stayed level while calling out corrective actions, the way he seemed, if anything, more at ease inside the pressure of the evaluation than he had been standing in the ordinary quiet of the hangar earlier that night. When it was finally finished, Breyer told him that if he flew, she would monitor every second of it from ground control, full telemetry feed, open channel the entire route, and that if she saw one indication something was wrong, he would divert immediately, no argument, no negotiation. Calder agreed. Breyer looked past him towards Serafina and asked if she was certain about this. Serafina looked at the aircraft gleaming under the floodlights, at the storm still hammering the world outside the hangar doors, at the quiet, unassuming man who had spent the last several hours dismantling both a sabotage plot and her own assumptions about who deserved her trust, and said that she had spent 7 months letting people decide what she was and was not capable of, and that she would like, for once tonight, to make the dangerous decision herself. Nobody argued with her. Marlowe closed the certification folder and handed it wordlessly to Breyer for the official record. And the ground crew began final preparations in earnest, running the checklist a second time with an obsessive thoroughness the earlier crew had not bothered with. Every access panel photographed, every cable traced, every credential physically verified, rather than trusted on faith. They boarded within the half hour. Serafina wheeled up the modified ramp and secured in the reinforced seating near the cockpit, Marlowe remaining behind at ground control beside Breyer despite his obvious reluctance to hand the aircraft over to anyone else. The cabin door sealed with a soft pneumatic hiss. The engines rose from their idle hum into a fuller, more purposeful roar, and somewhere beyond the hangar's steel walls, the storm waited, patient and enormous, entirely unaware that the woman it was trying to ground had never once, in her entire life, allowed weather to make her decisions for her. The Falcon lifted off the wet runway a few minutes after 2 in the morning, climbing hard into a sky the color of wet slate, rain sheeting across the windscreen faster than the wipers could clear it. Serafina sat just behind the cockpit divider, close enough to watch Calder work, and what she saw surprised her more than anything else that strange, unraveling night had offered so far. There was no tension in his shoulders, no white-knuckled grip on the controls, none of the outward performance of bravery she had half expected. He moved through each control input with an economy of motion that looked, to her untrained eye, almost effortless, the same unhurried precision he had shown while tracing a single faulty wire beneath the aircraft's belly hours earlier. He is not the man I met in that hangar, she thought, watching him scan the instrument panel with quiet, practiced eyes. That man kept himself small. This one does not know how. The storm did not make it easy. Turbulence rattled through the cabin in sudden, violent pockets, the aircraft dropping and catching itself again, with a shudder that traveled up through the floor and into her spine. She gripped the armrest without meaning to. And Calder, without turning around, said the aircraft was built for far worse than this. That the shaking they were feeling was well within tolerance. That discomfort was not the same thing as danger. Roughly 40 minutes into the flight, a soft chime sounded through the cockpit, and a new indicator flared amber across the panel. Calder's eyes moved to it immediately, his hands already adjusting before Serafina had even finished asking if they were all right. They would be, he said. When she pressed him, asking if he was sure, he admitted that he was not, switching the affected system over to a secondary backup with the same unhurried calm he had shown all night, but that he knew what to do about it. The honesty landed harder than reassurance would have. In the relative quiet that followed, Serafina finally asked what had happened during that test flight, the one he had never finished telling her about. Calder was quiet for a long moment before beginning, describing an airframe pushed deliberately past its rated limits to gather data nobody else wanted to risk collecting, a structural failure nobody had predicted, a radio call that cut out mid-sentence and never resumed. He had believed, before that day, that the best pilots were the ones who felt no fear at all. He understood now that the pilots worth trusting were not the ones who felt nothing, but the ones who felt everything and still made the right call anyway. Serafina told him she understood that better than he realized, and he glanced back at her, just briefly, something unspoken passing between them that neither one tried to name. The moment did not last. A sharp, unfamiliar tone sounded through the cockpit, followed immediately by a cascade of amber, and then red indicators sweeping across the panel in a pattern Calder had not seen outside of a simulator, built specifically to test catastrophic failure response. A portion of the aircraft's automated flight control system disengaged entirely, handing raw manual authority back to the pilot with none of the usual computer-assisted stability augmentation. Calder's hands tightened on the controls, every trace of his earlier ease sharpening instantly into total, focused concentration. A single line of text crossed the secondary display, small and clinical and utterly damning. Manual override activated, external source. Calder read it once and understood immediately what it meant. This was not weather. This was not a random equipment failure. Somebody, somewhere, was actively attempting to seize control of the aircraft's systems remotely, in real time, 400 miles from the hangar, where the sabotage had first begun. He did not have time to explain any of this to Serafina. He simply told her to hold on, in a voice so calm it somehow communicated the full weight of the danger more clearly than panic ever could have, and turned his complete attention to keeping the aircraft in the air. Ground control's voice crackled through the headset a moment later, Breyer's tone sharp with alarm, confirming what the cockpit display had already told him. Telemetry was showing an unauthorized access attempt originating from outside the aircraft's normal command structure. A digital intrusion layered cleverly beneath the storm's own interference, timed, Calder realized immediately, to look exactly like a weather-related malfunction. To anyone not paying close enough attention, somebody had planned for this flight to happen, and somebody had planned just as carefully for it to end badly. Calder disengaged every automated system he could isolate, dropping the aircraft into fully manual control, trusting his own hands and instincts over software that could no longer be trusted to serve him. The Falcon bucked hard through another pocket of turbulence, and for a long, suspended moment, the only sounds in the cockpit were the roar of the engines, the drum of rain against the windscreen, and the low, steady murmur of Calder, narrating his own corrections aloud, less for Serafina's benefit than for his own, the old habit of a test pilot, talking himself through the exact center of danger. Serafina did not scream, did not grip the armrest, did not do any of the things fear typically demanded of people in that seat. She watched him instead, memorizing the shape of his focus, and understood with sudden and total clarity that the man flying this aircraft through an active attempt to bring it down was the same man who had once flown into a failure so catastrophic it took a friend's life and had returned to the sky anyway, Not because the fear had left him, but because he had finally learned what to do with it. Whoever was doing this, Calder said through gritted teeth as he fought the controls back towards stability, was about to find out they had picked the wrong night. Back at ground control, Briar Knox worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood exactly how much was riding on the next several minutes, her fingers moving rapidly across two separate terminals as she attempted to trace the source of the intrusion signal, now clawing at the Falcon's systems from somewhere far below the storm. Marlowe stood behind her, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching numbers race past that meant far more to Briar than they meant to him. Though the tension in the room needed no translation, she confirmed she had a partial trace, the signal bouncing through 3 relay points, but the originating access point tracing back to an internal terminal, someone doing this from inside their own network, and not from the hangar, but from corporate headquarters, using authorization that should have required physical presence to activate. Serafina, still connected through her headset despite the chaos rattling through the cabin, told her to find out whose credential it was. It took Briar less than 90 seconds to isolate the answer, and when she found it, she read the name aloud with visible reluctance. The access credential belonged to Orson Creed. In the cockpit, Calder heard the name through his headset, even as he continued fighting the aircraft toward stability, and something in his expression tightened, though his hands never wavered on the controls. Serafina closed her eyes for a brief moment, absorbing the confirmation of a betrayal she had already half suspected, but had still, somewhere beneath her carefully guarded composure, hoped would prove untrue. 15 years, she said quietly. More to herself than to anyone listening, and this is what he decided I was worth. Calder told her not to give him that yet, that they had his credential but not his motive, that somebody capable of orchestrating something this layered had not done it alone, and had not done it for no reason. A man loyal enough to build 15 years of trust did not throw it away for nothing. Somebody had offered him something big enough to make the math work in his head, and finding out what that something was would lead them to who was really behind it. The aircraft steadied gradually as Calder worked through the remaining warnings one by one, isolating the compromised systems, restoring what could safely be restored, refusing to trust anything the intrusion might have touched. It was nearly 40 minutes later, with the storm finally beginning to loosen its grip, and the first pale suggestion of dawn bruising the eastern horizon, that Briar's investigation produced its second, more damning discovery. Buried within Orson's compromised account activity, time-stamped weeks before tonight's flight, was a pattern of communication with an external device registered to a name that made Serafina's stomach turn, even before Briar finished reading it aloud. Gideon Rusk, board member, the device pinging the same corporate network Orson had used tonight, multiple times, going back nearly a month. Serafina absorbed the name the way a person absorbs a diagnosis they had quietly feared but refused to name aloud. Gideon Rusk had sat across from her in board meetings for 6 years, had smiled at her through budget negotiations and shareholder disputes, had offered on more than one occasion since her accident a particular brand of gentle concern about her ability to continue leading a company as demanding as Vale Aeronautics. She had dismissed it at the time as old-fashioned condescension. She understood now, with sudden and furious clarity, that it had been something closer to a countdown. "He wants my seat," she said quietly, and Calder, piecing the motive together aloud even as he continued guiding the aircraft toward its final approach corridor, agreed that if she missed the board vote, if this flight ended in scandal or disaster, Gideon would not need to force her out. The board would do it for him. Serafina looked out the rain-streaked window at the horizon slowly brightening ahead of them, and felt something shift inside her chest, the last soft edges of grief and self-doubt burning away into something harder and far more useful. She had spent 7 months allowing people around her to define what her body's limitations meant for her mind. Her judgment. Her right to sit at the head of the table she had built with her own 2 hands. She was done allowing it. With 40 minutes remaining before the vote, she told Calder to move fast, and he brought the Falcon down through the last ragged edge of the storm system, with the same unhurried precision he had shown throughout the entire flight, the runway lights of Halcyon Research Campus emerging out of the gray pre-dawn mist like a promise finally being kept. The aircraft rolled to a stop near a small private terminal. engines spooling down into silence for the first time in nearly 2 hours. Calder sat motionless for a moment before removing his headset, and Serafina, watching him, understood that something significant had just happened inside him as well. Some old debt finally settled, some door that had been closed for years quietly reopening. She told him that he had done that without a single wasted motion, that nobody down there would have believed it if they had not watched him do it, and he answered that he had not done it to be believed. When she asked why, then, he considered the question for a long moment and said that somewhere along the way he had decided that walking away from something he was good at was not the same as protecting himself from loss. It was just loss, stretched out slower. Outside the cockpit window, the sky continued its slow brightening from bruised gray toward pale gold. And she found herself thinking, not for the first time that strange night, that the man beside her had somehow managed to fly them, not only out of a sabotaged aircraft, but out of the smaller, quieter prisons they had each been building around themselves for years. A car was already waiting on the tarmac, and beyond it, the research campus's administrative tower rose against the brightening sky, its top-floor windows glowing with the early lights of a board already gathering to decide, without her, what kind of future Vale Aeronautics would have. Serafina straightened her coat and looked toward the tower with the calm of a woman who understood exactly what she was walking into and had already decided she was not walking in alone. "Let's go finish this," she said. The boardroom occupied the entire top floor of the administrative tower, a long, glass-walled space that caught the earliest light of dawn and scattered it across a polished table where 12 members of the Vale Aeronautics Board sat in tense, uneasy silence. Gideon Rusk occupied the seat nearest the head of the table, close enough to project authority without technically claiming a position that was not yet his. And when the doors opened to admit Serafina, wheeling herself in with quiet, unhurried composure, something in his carefully arranged expression faltered for just a fraction of a second before recovering. He told her, with rehearsed surprise, that they had been told the storm had grounded all outbound flights tonight, and that they had assumed, under the circumstances, she would understand if they proceeded without her. She answered that she was sure they did, and rolled to her place at the head of the table, with the same unshakable presence she had carried into that room for 2 decades. Behind her, Calder Voss walked in, still in his rain-dampened flight jacket, carrying a slim data drive that he set on the table without ceremony, and several board members exchanged confused glances, uncertain what a maintenance contractor was doing in a meeting reserved for the company's most senior leadership. Before anyone could ask, Serafina began speaking, her voice carrying the practiced clarity of a woman who had spent years commanding rooms far more hostile than this one, laying out the events of the night methodically, without embellishment, without asking for sympathy she had no interest in receiving. The sabotaged sensor, the falsified credential, the remote intrusion attempt that had very nearly brought down an aircraft carrying the company's own chief executive during an active storm. Gideon's composure held admirably through most of it, though Serafina noted the small, involuntary tightening around his eyes when she reached the part concerning the access credential traced back to Orson Creed, and the flicker of genuine alarm that crossed his face when Breyer's evidence file, projected now onto the boardroom's main display, revealed the pattern of communication between Orson's compromised account and an external device registered under his own name. "This is circumstantial at best," Gideon said. His voice sharper now, the smoothness cracking at its edges, adding that device registrations could be spoofed, credentials could be stolen, and that she was asking this board to convict him based on data pulled together in the middle of a crisis by a man who, forgive him, appeared to be a mechanic. Calder stepped forward then, unhurried, and connected the data drive to the boardroom's terminal. A secondary log populated the screen. One Breyer had pulled directly from the aircraft's isolated backup recorder, a system specifically designed to remain untouched by any external network intrusion, precisely because it existed to catch exactly this kind of tampering. Every command sent to override the aircraft's flight systems tonight was captured here, independent of the corporate network the credential lived on, time-stamped, cross-referenced against the relay points Breyer had traced back to headquarters. This was not circumstantial, Calder said. his voice calm and utterly without theater. This was a recording of an active attempt to bring down a commercial aircraft with the company's chief executive on board. The room went very quiet. Marlowe, who had flown in separately with Breyer the moment the aircraft's data confirmed a viable landing, stepped forward to add his own account, confirming Calder's certification, confirming the professionalism with which the flight had ultimately been handled, despite active interference, lending the full weight of his own 22 years of credibility to a man he had mocked in a rain-soaked hangar less than 6 hours earlier. Gideon attempted, twice more, to redirect the board's attention, first toward questions of Serafina's fitness to lead, given the stress of the night's events, then toward vague accusations regarding the legitimacy of evidence gathered under emergency conditions. Both attempts dissolved beneath the weight of the data now displayed plainly across the screen. Undeniable in its precision, it was Serafina who delivered the final, quiet blow, her voice carrying none of the fury she had felt hours earlier in the rain-soaked hangar. Only the calm, immovable certainty of a woman who no longer needed anyone in that room to validate what she already knew about herself. She told them she did not need any of them to believe in her because she could no longer stand on her own two legs. She needed them to judge her by what she was still capable of doing. And what she was capable of, evidently, was surviving a sabotage attempt orchestrated by a member of that very board, and still arriving there, on time, with the evidence to prove it. The vote that followed was neither long nor close. Gideon Rusk was removed from the board before the sun had fully cleared the horizon outside the tall glass windows. His position dissolved amid a unanimous, if uncomfortable, consensus that no further discussion was required. Orson Creed's fate would take longer to resolve. An internal investigation launched before the meeting had even formally adjourned, though Serafina made clear, in the quiet minutes following the vote, that she intended to hear his side of it before deciding anything further. She was not yet ready to let 15 years collapse into a single verdict, not until she understood exactly what pressure had been placed on a man who had once been trustworthy enough to earn her trust in the first place. The merger vote proceeded afterward with the kind of quiet efficiency that only comes after a room has weathered something far more dangerous than a business decision. Serafina's signature went down at the bottom of the agreement, a little past 9 in the morning. The ink barely dry before the first congratulatory murmurs began circulating around the table, though she found, watching the sun now fully risen over the research campus grounds, that the merger felt like the smallest part of what she had actually won that night. Calder remained near the back of the room throughout the vote, unassuming despite everything the last several hours had revealed about him, and when the meeting finally adjourned and the board members filed out in 2s and 3s, murmuring about storms and sabotage, and a mechanic who had apparently once set an altitude record most of them had never even heard of, he lingered by the window, watching the light spread slowly across the tarmac where the Falcon sat resting, quiet now, its work for the night finally finished. Serafina wheeled over to join him, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, content simply to watch the morning arrive. She told him he could have let Marlowe fly it once the fault was cleared, that he did not have to be the one in that seat. And he admitted that he knew. When she asked why he had been, then, he considered the question the same way he had considered every question that night, carefully, without performance, and said that somebody had needed a pilot who understood that fear and competence were not opposites, and that somewhere around midnight, he had stopped being afraid of finding out whether he still had it in him. Serafina studied him for a long moment, the exhaustion of the night finally beginning to settle into her shoulders, though it carried none of the heaviness exhaustion usually brought. It felt instead like the particular tiredness that follows something worth doing. "Thank you," she said, "not for the flight, for not treating her like something fragile the entire time he was doing it." Calder almost smiled, and told her that would have been a waste of both their time. Several weeks passed before Calder returned to the hangar. And when he did, it was on an ordinary gray afternoon, entirely without the drama of the storm that had first brought his name into the center of Vale Aeronautics' story. He still wore his technician's coveralls, still moved through the space, with the same unassuming quiet that had once made him invisible to everyone who worked around him, though he noticed now that people looked up when he walked past, that Marlowe nodded to him, with something that had grown, over the intervening weeks, into genuine respect rather than reluctant tolerance. A new aircraft sat gleaming on the tarmac outside, delivered as part of the newly finalized merger, its hull still smelling faintly of fresh paint and factory grease. Serafina was waiting near its wing when he arrived, her wheelchair angled toward the open hangar doors, watching the same gray afternoon light he had just walked in from, and told him, without preamble, that she had a proposal for him. He assumed, for a moment, that she intended to offer him a position as her personal pilot, some formalized version of the role he had stumbled into during the chaos of that first night. She corrected the assumption before he could voice it, sliding a folder across the small table beside her chair, its cover printed with a title far more permanent than he had expected, Director of Flight Safety and Experimental Operations. She explained that he would oversee every experimental program the company ran, testing protocols, safety certification, the kind of work that required someone who understood exactly what it felt like to sit in that seat when everything went wrong, and that nobody else on her payroll had his instincts, that she would be foolish to let them go to waste fixing sensor arrays for the rest of his career. Calder studied the folder for a long moment without opening it, old caution rising in him out of habit rather than genuine hesitation, and Serafina asked if he was still afraid to fly. "Yes," he admitted. "Then why?" she asked. Was he considering saying yes to a job that would put him back in experimental cockpits on a regular basis? He looked out at the new aircraft resting on the tarmac, its paint still gleaming, its future still entirely unwritten, and thought about the years he had spent believing that walking away from the sky had been an act of self-preservation, when it had, in truth, simply been a slower, quieter version of the same fall he had once been so afraid of. Because this time, he said finally, he was not flying to prove he was not afraid. He was flying because he finally understood that being afraid had never actually been the problem. Serafina allowed herself something rare, a genuine, unguarded smile, the kind she had not permitted herself in a boardroom in longer than she cared to admit, and told him he had saved her company that night, and considerably more than that, if she was being honest. Calder shook his head and told her she had saved herself, that he had just happened to be standing nearby when she decided to do it. She wanted to argue the point, some old instinct rising to deflect credit the way she had deflected sympathy for months. But she found, studying the quiet certainty in his expression, that she did not actually disagree with him. She had spent 7 months believing the wheelchair had taken something essential from her, some core piece of her authority that could never be fully restored. It had taken a sabotaged flight, a storm, and a mechanic with an old flight certification buried in a locked cabinet for her to understand that what the accident had actually taken was far smaller than she believed, and what it had left behind, tested and confirmed under the worst possible circumstances, was more than enough. The new aircraft's engines began their pre-flight cycle a short while later. A routine test flight, scheduled for the following morning. And Calder walked toward it slowly, pausing at the base of the boarding stairs, the way he had paused countless times over the years he had spent grounding himself in maintenance work rather than risk the sky again. This time, though, the pause did not stretch into retreat. He looked up at the aircraft, at the gray afternoon light catching along its wings, and did not see, for the first time in a very long while, the shadow of the accident that had once driven him out of cockpits entirely. He saw instead simply a sky, waiting the way it always had, patient and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the fear a man carried into it, ready to be met again on whatever terms he chose to meet it. He climbed the stairs without hesitation. Some men leave the sky because they are afraid of falling. Calder Voss returned because he finally understood that falling was never the end.